For 7 years, Ren Sorrel had been the worst student Inspire Academy had ever produced. Every spell she cast fizzled, sputtered, or simply died in her hands. The other students laughed. The professor sighed. Even the charity board that paid her tuition had begun to ask whether the money might be better spent elsewhere. It would have been so much easier, everyone agreed, if the girl had simply been talentless rather than whatever strange, careful, unteachable thing she actually was. What none of them knew, what Ren had built her entire life around hiding, was that she was not failing at all. Somewhere beneath her ribs lived a fire that did not behave like other fire. It did not warm. It did not light. It consumed. She had felt it once, fully, on the night her parents died, and she had spent every day since making sure no one ever saw it again. Then came Headmaster Alaric Vance, a man the entire kingdom feared and no one claimed to know. He watched her fail her final examination with a perfect, textbook imperfection, and something in him went very still. Because Alaric Vance had seen real magic die in a person's hands before, and he had never once seen it look like that. He was about to discover exactly what Ren Sorrel was hiding, and the discovery would not stay secret for long. Chapter 1 The Levitation Charm was the simplest spell taught at Inspire Academy. First years mastered it within a week. Ren Sorrel had been attempting it, unsuccessfully, for the better part of 7 years, and today's failure was, if she was being honest with herself, one of her finer performances. "Ele vastum," she said, flicking her wrist the way Professor Hale had shown her 100 times. The feather on her desk twitched once, as if embarrassed on her behalf, and lay still. Laughter rippled through the practice hall. It always did. Ren had stopped flinching from it years ago, the way you stop flinching from rain once you've accepted you'll never own a proper coat. "Try again, Miss Sorrel," Professor Hale said, not unkindly, though his patience had the particular thinness of a man who had said the same sentence to the same girl every week since she was 12. She tried again. The feather did not move. Somewhere behind her, Lady Seraphine Voss made a small, delicate sound of disgust dressed up as pity, which was somehow worse than open mockery. "Perhaps the scholarship students simply aren't suited to fine spell work," Seraphine said to her circle of friends, pitched exactly loud enough to carry. "It isn't her fault. Some people aren't born with the blood for it." Ren kept her eyes on the feather and did not answer. Answering only ever made it worse. The truth, the one she would have died before speaking aloud, was that she could have lifted that feather without a wand, without a word, without trying at all. She could have lifted the entire desk. She could have lifted the entire hall, and everyone seated in it, and held them suspended in the white-black fire that lived coiled beneath her sternum like something sleeping and not quite tame. She had felt that fire only once at its full strength, 11 years ago, in a farmhouse that no longer existed because she had burned it to nothing, along with the 2 people inside it who had loved her. She had been 8 years old. She remembered very little of that night except the heat, and the silence afterward, and the way the village elder had looked at her like she was something that needed to be drowned rather than raised. So she had learned, slowly and at great cost, to do the opposite of what came naturally. Every spell she failed was a spell she had deliberately strangled in her own hands, like choking a candle before it could become a fire that ate the room. 7 years of practiced, convincing failure. 7 years of being laughed at by children who had no idea what she was protecting them from. "That's enough for today," Professor Hale said, with the air of a man retreating from a battlefield. "Miss Sorrel, see me after the trials next week. We need to discuss your continued enrollment." The hall emptied around her in 2s and 3s, voices already moving on to other gossip. Only one person stayed behind. "He's bluffing," Della Marsh said, dropping into the seat beside her. Della was the only other charity student in their year, a broad-shouldered girl from the dock quarter who had never once laughed at Ren, not even on the worst days. "They threaten to expel you every year. You're still here. Maybe this is the year they mean it. Maybe this is the year you finally make that feather move," Della said, bumping their shoulders together. "Wouldn't that be something? Imagine the look on Seraphine's face." "I'd settle for the look on Hale's face, honestly," Ren said. "He looks at me the way you'd look at a lock that's been stuck for so long you've stopped believing it ever had a key in the first place." "Maybe it doesn't need a key," Della said. "Maybe it just needs someone patient enough to keep trying the door." Ren managed a smile because Della deserved one, even though the thought of the feather actually moving sent something cold and electric down the back of her neck. She gathered her books, said her goodbyes, and walked the long way back to the dormitories, the way she always did, past the kitchen gardens where no one important ever lingered. The evening air smelled of cut grass and wood smoke from the kitchen chimneys, and for a few minutes she let herself simply breathe it in, the closest thing to peace her week ever offered. She thought, as she often did on these walks, about the night the village elder had come for her. She remembered very little of the fire itself, mercifully, but she remembered the cold that followed it with terrible clarity. The way the elder's lantern had trembled in his hand as he'd looked at the smoking ruin of the only home she'd ever known. The way he had not asked if she was hurt, only what she was. The traveling cleric who'd found her 3 days later, half-starved and silent, had been the first person to ask her name instead. She owed that cleric everything, and she had never once told him what she truly was, certain that the moment he knew, his kindness would curdle into the same fear she'd seen in the elder's lantern light. So she had learned to be small instead, unremarkable, a girl who failed her spells and apologized for taking up space in a hall full of children who would never have to apologize for anything. It was a quiet, lonely sort of survival, but it was survival. And after 11 years, she had stopped expecting it to feel like anything more than that. She did not see the man standing at the high window of the North Tower, watching the practice hall empty out below him, his expression unreadable even to the servants who had learned, over many years, never to ask Headmaster Vance what he was thinking. He had been watching for 3 weeks now. He had seen Ren Sorrel fail the levitation charm 140 times, by his own private count, and there was something about the failures that itched at the back of his mind like a word he could almost remember. Real failure looked clumsy, uneven, surprised by itself. Hers looked rehearsed. Chapter 2 Alaric Vance had not always been a man people crossed the room to avoid. There had been a version of him once, younger and considerably less careful, who had laughed at dinner and argued about magical theory until the candles burned down and meant every word of his promises. That man had died somewhere in the ash of a battlefield 20 years ago, alongside the only mentor who had ever truly understood him, and what had grown back in his place was colder, harder, and infinitely more useful to a kingdom that needed someone willing to make impossible decisions. He had built Calden Spire into the most disciplined academy in the realm, not out of love for teaching, but because discipline was the only wall standing between ordinary students and the thing that slept beyond the kingdom's northern border. Maldrek. The old texts called him the Hollow King, though Alaric privately thought the title gave him too much dignity. 3 centuries ago, Maldrek had been a man, the first and only bearer of a bloodline magic so dangerous the old council had outlawed its very name. The histories disagreed on exactly how he had been undone, but they agreed on what remained. A seal in the northern mountains, ancient and weakening, and the certain knowledge that should it ever fully break, no living mage would be strong enough to put it back. The council's solution was simple and brutal. Hunt down anyone born with the bloodline before Maldrek could find them first. The bearers, the council called them, Cinderborn. There had been no confirmed sighting of one in over 60 years, and most scholars assumed the bloodline had finally, mercifully, died out. Alaric had assumed the same thing, right up until he watched a scholarship girl fail her 140th levitation charm with the same unnatural, controlled stillness every single time. "You wanted to see me, Headmaster?" Professor Hale stood in the doorway of the tower study, hat in hand, the way every member of staff stood when summoned to this particular room. "The Sorrel girl," Alaric said. "Tell me about her history. Everything you have." Hale blinked, clearly having expected a different topic. "Orphaned at 8. Found wandering near the border villages with no memory of her family, by her own account. The charity board took her in on the recommendation of a traveling cleric who said she showed promise." "Promise? His word, not mine," Hale said. "She's shown nothing since. 7 years, and she can't lift a feather. I recommended dismissal twice. The board overruled me both times. Gods know why. What does the girl herself say when you press her? Does she seem distressed by her own failures, or merely resigned to them?" Hale considered the question with the air of a man who had genuinely never thought to ask it of himself. "Resigned, mostly. She apologizes a great deal. More than the failures alone would seem to warrant, now that you mention it. Near the border villages," Alaric repeated quietly. the northern border villages, within a day's ride of the seal. Is something wrong, Headmaster? Alaric looked back out the window, though the practice hall below had long since emptied. Has she ever shown anger? Real anger. Not sadness. Not embarrassment. Rage. Hale considered this with the particular discomfort of a man being asked a question he had never thought to ask himself. Never, Headmaster. If anything, she's the most controlled student I've ever taught. Almost unnervingly so, for a girl who fails as often as she does. Almost unnervingly so. Thank you, Professor. That will be all. When Hale had gone, Alaric remained at the window a long time, turning over a thought he did not want to be having. There was a difference, he knew better than almost anyone alive, between a student who could not perform magic and a student who would not allow herself to. The former trembled with frustration. The latter held herself like a soldier standing over a buried weapon, terrified that any sudden movement might wake it. He had seen that particular stillness only once before, in the eyes of his own mentor, in the final hour before the man had walked into the seal and never walked out again. If Wren Sorrel was what he was beginning to suspect she was, then the council would want her found, contained, and very likely destroyed before Maldrek's agents could reach her first. Alaric intended to find her before either of them did. He thought, not for the first time that night, of the man who had taught him everything he knew about controlling the uncontrollable. Master Edrin had not been Cinderborn himself, only a scholar who had spent 40 years studying the bloodline's old texts, and it had been his quiet, stubborn theory that the curse was not in the fire itself, but in the fear surrounding it, that every bearer in recorded history had been hunted so swiftly and so young that none had ever been given the chance to learn what their own power actually wanted. Edrin had died proving that theory at the foot of the northern seal, holding a breach shut with nothing but borrowed time and his own failing strength, buying Alaric and a dozen others the hour they needed to escape. Alaric had been 23 years old. He had not cried at the funeral, because there had been no body to bury, only a scorched circle of frost where a man had stood, and he had sworn that night, in the particular silent fury of the very young, that he would spend the rest of his life making sure no one else's sacrifice was ever wasted so completely. He had built an academy instead of an army. He had told himself, for 2 decades, that it was enough. Watching Wren Sorrel fail her 140th levitation charm, he was no longer entirely certain that it was. Chapter 3 The fire that nearly ended Wren's careful 7 years of hiding started, of all things, with a dropped lantern in the east stairwell. It was an ordinary evening right up until it wasn't. The corridors had already gone quiet for the night. Most students settled into their rooms, the kind of hour Wren usually treasured precisely because nothing ever happened in it. She remembered thinking, climbing the stairs with her arms full of borrowed books, that it had been a peaceful week, the first in longer than she could recall. She would later wonder, with a particular bitterness of hindsight, whether the universe simply could not abide letting her have more than 7 peaceful days in a row. She had been on her way back from the library, later than she should have been, arms full of books no one expected her to actually read, when she heard Della's voice pitch sharp with panic 2 floors below. By the time Wren reached the landing, Flame had already caught the old tapestries lining the stairwell, and Della was on the wrong side of it, coughing, trapped between a wall of fire and a door that had warped shut in the heat. There was no one else in the corridor. No professor. No prefect with a water charm and steady hands. Just smoke thickening fast, and her only friend in the world choking on the other side of it. Wren did not decide to act. Her body simply moved, the way a hand moves away from a flame before the mind has finished registering pain. Della! Get down, cover your face! She didn't think about the spell. She had spent 7 years thinking about spells, strangling them, watching them die in her palms on purpose. There was no time for any of that now. She reached for the fire the way she had never once let herself reach for anything, and the white-black heat beneath her ribs surged up to meet her call like something starved. The ordinary flames didn't go out. They simply stopped existing, swallowed whole by something that made no light at all, a darkness with the shape of fire and none of its warmth. For 1 terrible second, the corridor went utterly silent, utterly cold, and Wren felt the old hunger in her chest reach for more, for the warped door, for the smoke, for Della herself. No, she gasped aloud, and clawed the feeling back down into the small, controlled space she had built for it over 11 years of practice, brick by brick, failure by failure. The hunger receded. The corridor was simply dark and smoking and empty of flame. Della stared at her through tears and soot, too shaken to have seen anything clearly, already stammering thanks Ren barely heard. She did not notice the second figure in the stairwell shadows until he stepped into what little light remained. Headmaster Vance had not moved, had not spoken, had not so much as drawn his wand, though Ren would learn later that he had been 3 seconds from doing exactly that. He looked at the place where fire had been and was no longer, and then he looked at Ren, and his expression contained absolutely nothing she could read, which frightened her far more than anger would have. "Miss Sorrel," he said. "My study. Now." "Headmaster, I can explain. Now," he said again, and there was something underneath the word that made her wolfless, magicless, careful pretense of a life feel, for the first time in 7 years, like it had already ended. Della was safely on her feet by then, coughing but unharmed, surrounded by arriving staff who had finally noticed the smoke. No one was looking at Ren. No one but the one man whose attention she had spent 11 years trying never to attract, and whose quiet, patient suspicion had finally, on this particular evening, found exactly the evidence it had been waiting for. That itch had cost him sleep more nights than he cared to admit, and it was that same itch, 3 weeks into his quiet observation of her, that had him crossing the courtyard toward the east stairwell the moment he smelled smoke on the evening air, well before any alarm bell had been rung. She followed him up the tower stairs with her heart slamming against her ribs, certain she was walking toward her own exposure, her own ending, and unable to think of a single lie large enough to undo what he had just seen. Chapter 4. The headmaster's study was smaller than Ren had imagined, lined floor to ceiling with books that looked older than the kingdom itself. Vance closed the door behind them with a quiet click that somehow felt louder than the fire had been. "Sit," he said. She sat. He did not. He stood across the desk from her with his arms folded, studying her with the same unreadable patience he'd worn in the stairwell, and Ren found she could not look away from him even though every instinct screamed at her to keep her eyes down. Small, harmless. "I am going to ask you a question," he said, "and you are going to consider very carefully before you decide to lie to me again. Headmaster, how long have you been failing your spells on purpose?" The room seemed to tilt. Ren's mouth opened and closed around several half-formed denials before settling on silence, which was, she realized too late, its own confession. 7 years, he said when she didn't answer. "I've watched you fail the same charm 140 times. Failure has a shape, Miss Sorrel. Real failure is clumsy. It surprises the person doing it. Yours has never once surprised you. I don't know what I saw in that stairwell wasn't a spell from any book in this academy," he said, and for the first time something other than calm control bled into his voice, something that sounded almost like exhaustion. "I've seen that particular darkness exactly once before, in the man who taught me everything I know, on the night he died trying to hold back something the histories call the Hollow King." Ren's blood went to ice. "You're Cinderborn," he said quietly. "Aren't you?" There was no point pretending any longer. She felt the weight of 11 years collapse onto her shoulders all at once, and to her own horror, she began to cry, silently, furiously, hating herself for it. "I didn't ask for it," she whispered. "I never wanted it. It killed my parents. I was 8 years old, and I burned down my own home because I was frightened of a thunderstorm, and I have spent every single day since making sure it never happens again. I fail on purpose because if I don't, people die. That's all this is. That's all I am." Vance was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost its sharp edges entirely. "You held it back tonight," he said. "Even at full strength, even with someone you love in danger, you pulled it back into yourself rather than let it spread. Do you understand how difficult that is? Stronger mages than you have died trying to control far less. It doesn't matter how hard I try. The council will say what they always say about people like me." "The council isn't here," he said. "I am." She looked up at him, startled, searching his face for the mockery she was certain must be hiding somewhere in that statement, and found none. "I should report you," he continued, almost to himself. "It would be the responsible thing to do. The council has standing orders regarding any confirmed Cinderborn bloodline. They would take you to the capital. They would study you, contain you, and very likely conclude that containment isn't worth the risk. Then why haven't you called the guards already? He was quiet for a long moment, and when he answered, it was with a kind of honesty that seemed to cost him something. Because I don't believe what they would do to you is justice. And because I think, Miss Sorrel, that the kingdom may need exactly what you've spent 7 years trying to bury. What do you mean? I mean, he said, that I am going to teach you to control it properly, in secret, and you are going to continue failing in public exactly as convincingly as you have been. No one outside this room can know what you are. Not your friends. Not the staff. No one. Why would you do that for me? Something flickered behind his eyes, gone before she could name it. Because someone did it for me once, a long time ago, and I have spent 20 years wishing I had been worth the risk he took. What happened to him? He died holding back the very thing your bloodline is feared for, Alaric said quietly. Not because the fire failed him, because he had no one to help him carry it, and try to hold the whole weight alone. I have no intention of letting that particular history repeat itself in front of me a second time. Ren studied him for a long moment, seeing past the cold reputation that had followed him through every corridor of the academy to something far more tired and far more human underneath it. You're not what they say you are. And what do they say I am? Heartless. Unreachable. A man who'd sooner expel a student than comfort one. They're not entirely wrong, he said, with the ghost of something that might, on a less guarded man, have been a smile. I find comfort considerably harder than discipline. But I would rather be unreachable to an entire kingdom than fail the one person standing in front of me who actually needs reaching. He held out his hand, not to shake hers, but simply open, palm up, an offer rather than a command. Do we have an agreement, Miss Sorrel? Ren looked at that open hand for a long moment, 11 years of careful loneliness pressing against her chest, and found herself, for the first time since the fire that had taken everything from her, willing to trust someone enough to take it. We do, she said. Chapter 5. Their lessons began in secret, 3 nights a week, in a sealed chamber beneath the north tower that Vance claimed had not been used since before he became headmaster. He warded the room himself, layer after careful layer, until even Ren could feel the silence pressing in around them like something solid. Fire wants to spread, he told her during their first session, pacing a slow circle around her while she sat cross-legged on the cold stone floor. That is its nature, and fighting its nature is exhausting and, eventually, doomed to fail. What you've been doing for 7 years isn't control. It's suppression. There's a difference. Feels the same to me. Suppression is a dam holding back a flood. Eventually the dam breaks. Control is a riverbed. You don't stop the water. You give it somewhere to go. It took weeks before she understood what he meant in practice, rather than theory. Weeks of failed attempts that left her shaking and exhausted. Of small fires she let flicker to life only to lose her nerve and crush them flat again, of Vance's voice low and steady through every single failure. Never once impatient in the way Professor Hale had been. Never once treating her fear as foolishness. You flinch the moment it grows past the size of a candle, he observed one night, after she'd extinguished a flame the size of her palm out of pure reflexive panic. Why? Because the last time I let it grow past the size of a candle, I burned down my own house. You were 8 years old, alone, and terrified during a thunderstorm with no one to teach you, he said. You are 19 now, and you are not alone. Something about the way he said it, simple and certain, settled into her chest like warmth that had nothing to do with fire at all. There were nights the training failed entirely, and those nights taught her almost as much as the successes did. Once, after a particularly brutal session in which she'd lost control twice in a row and scorched a black ring into the stone floor before managing to claw the flame back down, she sat shaking against the chamber wall and refused, for nearly an hour, to try again. I can't, she said, voice cracking in a way she rarely allowed herself in front of anyone. Every time I let it grow, some part of me is 8 years old again, standing in the doorway of a burning house, and I can't tell anymore whether I'm controlling the fire or whether it's controlling me. Alaric did not offer empty reassurance. He sat down across from her on the cold stone instead, close enough that their knees nearly touched, and waited until she looked at him before he spoke. Then let's separate the two, he said. The girl in the doorway didn't cause that fire because she was cruel or careless. She caused it because she was frightened and alone, and no one had ever taught her there was another way to feel safe. That girl deserves grief, not blame. But she is not the same person sitting in front of me now, who has spent 11 years proving, every single day, that she is capable of extraordinary restraint. You are not fighting the same fire you fought at 8 years old. You are simply still flinching from the memory of it. How do you know all this? How do you understand it so well? Because I have spent 20 years building an entire academy out of my own grief, he said, and only recently started wondering whether grief alone was ever going to be enough. She reached out, hesitant, and rested her hand over his on the cold stone floor. He did not pull away. It was on one of those quiet nights, weeks into their secret lessons, that she noticed him watching her in a way that had nothing to do with magical theory. She had finally managed to hold a flame the size of a small lantern, steady and obedient in her open palms, the white-black light flickering gently rather than hungrily for the first time in her life, and when she looked up to see if he approved, she found him already looking at her with an expression she had no framework for, having never once in her life been the recipient of it before. "What?" she asked, suddenly self-conscious, letting the flame wink out. "Nothing," he said, too quickly for a man who rarely said anything without intending to. "That was well done. Headmaster, Alaric," he said. "When we're down here." Just Alaric. The use of his given name felt like its own kind of fire, smaller and far more dangerous than the one she'd just been holding. There were lighter evenings, too, ones that had nothing to do with fear or fire at all. Once, after a particularly grueling session, Alaric had produced, with no explanation whatsoever, a small paper-wrapped pastry from one of the kitchens and set it down in front of her like an offering, refusing to acknowledge her startled laughter or admit that headmasters were not generally expected to know which pastries a scholarship student preferred. "How did you even know I liked these?" "I make it my business to know a great many things about my students," he said, with the particular dignity of a man pretending he had not, in fact, asked Della directly the week before. "You're a terrible liar, Headmaster." "I am an excellent liar," he corrected. "I am simply choosing, on this occasion, not to bother with you." It became, over the following weeks, harder and harder to pretend the late-night lessons were only about magic. She found herself looking forward to the sealed chamber beneath the North Tower with an eagerness that had nothing to do with mastering her bloodline and everything to do with the particular way Alaric's careful, guarded face softened when she succeeded at something, as though her victories were somehow also his own. She told herself it meant nothing. He was the headmaster. She was a charity student who could barely string together a passing grade in public, and privately carried a curse that had already taken 2 lives. There was no version of a story where a man like Alaric Vance looked twice at a girl like her. "And yet, you're improving faster than I expected," he said one evening, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him even through the chill of the underground chamber, his hand briefly steadying hers as she held a flame twice the size of any she'd managed before. "Faster than I did when I was first taught to do this." "You can do this too?" Something shuddered behind his eyes. "Not exactly. Not the same gift. But I understand what it costs to hold something dangerous inside yourself and call it discipline instead of fear." She turned to look at him properly then, and found him already closer than she'd realized, close enough that the careful distance both of them had been maintaining for weeks suddenly felt very thin indeed. Neither of them moved for a long moment. Then the chamber door groaned open behind them, and they stepped apart so quickly the flame in Wren's palms went out entirely, plunging the room into darkness lit only by a single staff light in the doorway and the unmistakable, delighted voice of Lady Seraphine Voss. "Well," Seraphine said, "isn't this interesting?" Chapter 6. Seraphine had followed them, it turned out, for 3 nights running, certain that the headmaster's late hours and the scholarship girl's sudden absences from the dormitory added up to something scandalous, though even she had not guessed quite how scandalous until that moment. "I won't tell anyone what I think I just walked in on," Seraphine said sweetly, the threat in her voice unmistakable beneath the honey. "If you tell me what that light was a moment ago, I've never seen a flame that color." Vance's expression had returned to its usual unreadable calm with terrifying speed. "You saw nothing of a kind, Lady Voss. This chamber is used for restricted theoretical demonstrations. I would caution you against repeating wild speculation, particularly speculation that might be construed as accusing your headmaster of impropriety. It was a clever answer, sharp enough to make Seraphine hesitate, but Wren saw the calculation behind her eyes and knew, with the particular dread of someone who has spent her whole life being underestimated by people exactly like Seraphine Voss, that the matter was far from settled. It was not settled. 3 days later, Wren received a note in an unfamiliar hand, slipped beneath her dormitory door sometime in the night. It contained no signature, only a single line. I know what color fire that was. Meet me at the old chapel at midnight, or I tell the council everything. She went, because the alternative was unthinkable, and found not Seraphine waiting in the moonlit ruin, but a stranger in dark traveling clothes, a man whose eyes held a particular hungry stillness that made every instinct she possessed scream at her to run. "You're further along than we hoped," the stranger said, studying her the way a buyer studies livestock. "Lady Voss has been very helpful to our cause. She doesn't know what you truly are, of course. She thinks she's simply trading gossip for gold. But we know exactly what you are, Cinderborn, and our master has been waiting a very long time for someone like you to wake up." "Your master," Wren managed, throat dry. "The Hollow King does not forgive easily," the stranger said. "But he has been patient with the seal weakening these past years, knowing eventually his blood would call to its own kind. You feel it too, don't you? The hunger underneath the fire. It isn't only yours. It's his. It has always been his. Get away from me. You could end this quietly," he continued, ignoring her entirely. "Come north. Open the seal yourself on your own terms, and he will spare every soul in this academy you seem so fond of pretending to care about. Refuse, and we will simply take you, and burn whatever stands in our way getting there." "Why would he want me at all?" Wren said, fighting to keep her voice steady, "if he already has an entire seal full of his own power waiting to be freed?" The stranger's smile widened, patient and almost pitying. "Because a seal cannot walk through a kingdom's front gates wearing a friendly face, Cinderborn. A seal cannot sit in a classroom for 7 years gathering trust nobody thought to question. You are not merely his blood. You are his key, and keys, in my long experience, work best when they want to be turned." "I will never want that." "Wanting," the stranger said softly, "has very little to do with it in the end." Wren ran. She did not remember most of the path back to the academy grounds, only the cold burn of her own breath and the white-black fire roaring beneath her ribs, desperate to be released against a threat finally large enough to deserve it. She held it down through sheer force of will and arrived at Alaric's tower shaking, so badly he had to catch her by the shoulders before she collapsed. "Tell me everything," he said, and she did. Every word. The chapel, the stranger, the Hollow King's offer, Seraphine's unwitting betrayal sold for gold she likely thought meaningless. Alaric's face went very still, very cold, in a way Wren had not seen since the night in the stairwell. "They know what you are," he said, "which means we no longer have the luxury of time. What do? "We prepare," he said, "for the very real possibility that the Council and Maldrek's agents arrive at the same conclusion at nearly the same time. If that happens, Wren, you will need every ounce of control we have built these past months. And I will need you to trust me more than you have ever trusted anyone in your life." "I already do," she said, before she'd fully decided to say it, and watched something in his expression crack open with a tenderness that frightened her far more than any fire ever had. They sat together long into the night going over every possible scenario: council interference, Maldrek's agents arriving early, Seraphine selling out further secrets in exchange for whatever coin or promise had bought her loyalty in the first place. At some point, exhaustion blurred the careful professional distance they had both been clinging to, and Wren found herself with her head resting against Alaric's shoulder, neither of them commenting on it, both of them too tired and too frightened to pretend it meant nothing. "If this goes wrong," she said quietly, staring at the dying fire in his study hearth, an ordinary fire, the kind that only ever warmed, "I need you to know that these past months have been the only time in 11 years I haven't felt completely alone." "It will not go wrong," Alaric said, though his voice carried none of its usual certainty. "But for whatever it is worth, Wren Sorrel, you have not been alone since the night I watched you put out a fire in a stairwell and decided, against every piece of careful judgment I have built over 20 years, that I was going to keep your secret regardless of what it cost either of us." She fell asleep before she could answer him properly, and when she woke at dawn, his cloak was draped carefully over her shoulders, and he had not moved from the chair across the desk all night, watching over her the way a man watches over something he has already, quietly, decided he cannot afford to lose. Chapter 7. The sealing trials had been a cult-inspired tradition for 200 years, a public examination held before the full council and visiting nobility, in which final-year students demonstrated mastery over their craft to earn their formal license to practice. Ren had dreaded it every year of her enrollment, as the day her careful failures would finally cost her everything. This year, she dreaded it for an entirely different reason. She felt at the moment she stepped into the great hall, the wrongness threading through the crowd like smoke before fire. Too many unfamiliar faces among the visiting dignitaries. Too many eyes that lingered on her a fraction too long. Steady, Alaric murmured as he passed her in the corridor before the trials began, the single word carrying more comfort than it should have been able to hold. Whatever happens in there, I will not let them take you. The trials proceeded in order of seniority, student after student performing their charms and transfigurations to polite applause, until at last Lady Seraphine Voss took her place at the center of the hall, her chosen spell a complicated lightning conjuration designed to dazzle exactly the sort of audience watching her. It went wrong almost immediately. Ren felt it before anyone else in the hall did, the unnatural cold threading through Seraphine's lightning, a corruption layered into the spell that had nothing to do with Seraphine's own skill and everything to do with someone outside the hall pulling invisible strings. The conjured bolt arced wide, struck the old tapestries lining the walls, and within seconds the great hall was burning exactly as the stairwell had burned months before, except now there was no escaping it, no quiet corner in which to act unseen. Screaming. Chaos. The council members scrambling for the doors while students who had spent years mocking her for her uselessness now looked, for the first time, genuinely afraid. Della was 3 rows back, pinned against an overturned bench, her sleeve already catching at the edge where the flame had spread fastest. She caught Ren's eye across the smoke and did not scream for help, did not beg, only shook her head once. A small, fierce, unmistakable warning. Don't. Not for me. Not if it costs you everything. It was, Ren thought distantly, exactly the kind of thing Della would do, and exactly the reason Ren had no intention of listening to her. Alaric's eyes found hers across the burning hall, and in them she read the same impossible choice she felt clawing at her own chest. Stay hidden and let people burn, or save them and be seen. She had made this choice once before, in a stairwell, for one person she loved. She made it again now, for a room full of people who had given her nothing but cruelty, because some choices, she realized, were never really about what people deserved. Ren did not strangle the fire this time. She opened her arms to it. The white-black light swallowed the ordinary flame whole, spreading not with hunger but with purpose, exactly as Alaric had taught her, a riverbed rather than a flood. Within moments the hall stood smoking but unburned, every life inside it intact, and 200 witnesses stood in absolute silence staring at the scholarship girl who had failed every spell for 7 years, glowing faintly with a darkness none of them had ever seen before. Cinderborn, someone whispered, and the word spread through the hall like its own kind of fire. The council moved with terrifying speed. Within minutes, armed guards had surrounded her, the eldest councilman declaring in a voice that shook with barely contained fear that the bearer of the forbidden bloodline would be taken to the capital immediately, contained, and dealt with according to ancient and unforgiving law. She just saved every life in this room, Alaric said, stepping between Ren and the advancing guards with a calm that did not match the fury Ren could feel rolling off him in waves. You would repay her with chains. The law is the law, Headmaster Vance. Stand aside, or be considered complicit. Then consider me complicit, Alaric said, and reached for an old leather-bound volume one of the council's own scribes carried, flipping it open to a passage he clearly already knew by heart. Article 11, the Warden's Bond. Any headmaster of a chartered academy may claim guardianship and full magical responsibility for a dangerous bearer in lieu of council custody, provided the binding is sealed before witnesses and accepted freely by both parties. The hall erupted into murmurs. The eldest councilman's face went the color of old parchment. You cannot be serious, I have never been more serious in my life, Alaric said, and turned to Ren, lowering his voice so that only she could hear him over the chaos. It binds our magic together, Ren. It will let me share the burden of containing what you carry, and it places you under my protection in the eyes of every law this kingdom recognizes. But it cannot be undone, and I will not force it on you. Tell me you want this, or tell me to let them take you, and I will respect whichever you choose. Ren looked at the chains in the guard's hands, at the fear and wonder warring on every watching face, and then at Alaric, who had spent months teaching her to trust her own fire instead of fearing it, who had offered his open hand the very first night he discovered her secret, and never once closed it against her since. I want this, she said. I choose you. The warden's bond settled over them both like warm light, visible to every witness in the hall, a faint golden thread connecting her chest to his that made several councilmen take an involuntary step backward. It was not a wedding, but it felt, to both of them, like something very close to one. The hall slowly emptied, council members departing in tight, uneasy clusters, nobles whispering behind gloved hands, students staring at her with an expression that was no longer mockery but had not yet decided what to become instead. Della found her first, throwing her arms around Ren's neck hard enough to hurt, sobbing into her shoulder about every cruel thing she hadn't said over 7 years of watching her best friend fail spells. She now understood Ren had never actually been failing at all. You could have told me, Della said, pulling back to glare at her through tears. I would have kept your secret. I would have kept it forever. I know, Ren said. I just couldn't risk it. Not even with you. You're risking it with him now. Della's eyes flicked toward Alaric, who stood a respectful distance away, giving them privacy he clearly did not have to give. Headmaster Vance, of all people. He's not what I expected either, Ren admitted. Della studied her for a long moment, then sighed the particular long-suffering sigh of someone watching a friend fall in love against every reasonable instinct. Well, at least he didn't let them put chains on you. I suppose that's a start. Chapter 8 The Bond did not satisfy the council for long. Within days, word reached the capital, and within a week, formal writs arrived demanding Ren be surrendered for examination regardless of any binding the headmaster claimed to have performed. Alaric refused every one of them, and the academy itself became, slowly and uneasily, a fortress under siege from its own kingdom. It was during this tense standoff that Maldrek's agents struck. They came at night, a dozen of them slipping through wards that should have held against far worse, guided unerringly toward the one dormitory wing where Ren slept, and Ren understood with cold certainty, the moment she heard Della scream down the corridor, exactly who had given them the path. Lady Seraphine Voss stood in the doorway of the dormitory, pale and shaking and clearly out of her depth in whatever she had allowed herself to become a part of. I didn't know, Seraphine said, voice cracking, as the stranger from the chapel pushed past her with several others, ropes of binding magic already crackling in their hands. I swear I didn't know they meant to take her. I only wanted gold. I had never meant for... Move, the stranger snapped, shoving Seraphine aside without ceremony, the casual cruelty of it more honest than anything he'd said in the chapel. Seraphine hit the floor hard, and for a moment Ren saw something shift in her face, some final piece of careful self-interest cracking open into genuine horror at what her petty gossip had actually purchased. Stop, Seraphine said, scrambling upright, her voice raw in a way Ren had never heard from her before. Stop, please. This isn't what I agreed to. No one stopped. No one was listening to a disgraced, noble girl anymore, least of all the men she had unwittingly armed, and Ren understood, even through her own rising panic, that Seraphine's horror was real, even if it had come far too late to matter. Ren felt the bond flare warm and urgent against her chest, Alaric's awareness reaching for hers across the academy grounds even before he physically arrived, and somehow that warmth steadied her more than any amount of practice control ever had. She was not alone in this. She had not been alone in months. She fought. For the first time in 11 years, she let the fire answer fully, white-black flame roaring up around her in a column that sent 2 of the agents reeling backward, screaming. It was glorious and terrifying in equal measure, and for one dizzying moment she understood exactly why the old council had feared this bloodline enough to outlaw its name. But there were too many of them, and the binding ropes found her wrists before she could press the advantage, cold iron threaded with old magic that smothered the fire like a hand closing over a candle. "No," she screamed, the word torn between fury and something closer to grief, as they dragged her toward the broken window and the waiting horses beyond. Alaric arrived in time to see the last of them disappear over the academy wall with Ren bound and struggling between them, and the sound he made, Della would later say, was not entirely human. He did not waste time on guards or council writs. He rode north alone through the night, the bond between himself and Ren burning brighter and more desperate with every mile, until at last it led him to the foot of the mountains where the old seal lay, weakened and groaning, and the agents of the Hollow King stood waiting with their prize. He had ridden this same northern road once before, 20 years ago, trailing behind Edrin's company with a heart full of confidence that had not yet learned what it cost to lose someone. He found himself, somewhere past the 3rd-mile marker, praying to gods he had stopped believing in the night his mentor died, not for victory, only for one more chance to say the things he had never quite found the courage to say out loud. "Headmaster Vance," the stranger from the chapel said, almost pleasantly, as Alaric dismounted at the mouth of the ancient pass. "You've saved us the trouble of fetching you ourselves. Our master will be very pleased to finally settle an old debt with someone who actually remembers him." Alaric's mentor's face flashed behind his eyes, 20 years gone and still unburied in every way that mattered. "Then let's not keep him waiting," he said, and drew his wand. Chapter 9. The seal stood at the heart of a frozen valley, a column of black stone webbed through with fractures of pale light, and through those fractures Ren could feel something vast and ancient pressing outward, hungry and patient and unmistakably familiar, like meeting a distant relative she had never wanted to know existed. It spoke to her, not in words exactly, but in something that felt like words, a low and patient voice threading through her own thoughts as though it had always lived there, waiting for her to grow loud enough to hear it. "You are tired of hiding," it seemed to say. "I remember what that felt like. Let me carry it for you. Let me carry all of it." For one terrifying moment, the offer almost sounded like kindness. They had bound her at the base of the seal itself, the binding ropes drawing the white-black fire out of her in slow, agonizing threads, feeding it directly into the cracks where it pooled like blood into an open wound. "Just a little more," the stranger murmured, almost reverent now, watching the seal's fractures widen with every stolen thread of her fire. "He has waited 3 centuries. A little longer means nothing to him." She heard the fighting before she saw it, Alaric carving through the agents at the valley's edge with a speed and ferocity that made her chest ache with something far too large for the moment, but even as he fought closer, she felt the seal's hunger growing faster than he could possibly reach her. "Alaric!" she screamed, and the bond between them flared so violently that several of the agents staggered, clutching their heads. He reached her at last, cutting the binding ropes with a single sharp word, and pulled her into his arms as the fire she'd lost came roaring back into her chest, wilder now, angrier, calling to the vast, hungry presence behind the cracking seal with an intensity she could no longer contain through ordinary discipline alone. "It wants to merge with him," she gasped against Alaric's shoulder. "I can feel it. If I let it go, even for a second, it will finish breaking the seal itself." "Then don't let it go," Alaric said, framing her face in both hands, forcing her eyes to his even as the valley shook around them. "You are not a vessel for him, Ren. You are not a continuation of his curse. You are the first Cinderborn in 3 centuries who chose, every single day for 11 years, not to become what he is. That choice is yours. It has always been yours. Make it again now. What if I'm not strong enough? You held a fire that killed your parents inside your own chest for 11 years, and never once let it touch another living soul until the moment you chose to," Alaric said fiercely. "There is no version of strength greater than that, Ren. Not in this valley. Not anywhere in this kingdom." Behind him, the stranger from the chapel was screaming something about destiny and blood and inevitability, and the seal's cracks had widened into something resembling a doorway, pale light pouring out in pulses like a heartbeat trying to restart after centuries of stillness. Ren closed her eyes and reached, not for the hunger this time, but for the riverbed Alaric had spent months teaching her to build. She let the fire flow, vast and white-black, and finally fully hers, and instead of feeding it into the seal's cracks, she pressed it against them, sealing rather than shattering, an answer rather than a surrender. The valley screamed with her. Light and dark fought across the frozen stone for what felt like hours and was likely only seconds, the bond between herself and Alaric the only steady thread holding her to who she had chosen to be rather than who she had been born to become. And then, all at once, it ended. The cracks sealed shut, darker and more solid than before, the hungry pressure behind them receding like a tide pulled back out to sea. The agents who survived the valley's collapse fled north into the dark, the stranger from the chapel among them, his certainty of destiny shattered along with whatever hold he had thought he held over her. Ren collapsed against Alaric's chest, exhausted beyond words, and felt his arms close around her, shaking with an intensity that told her exactly how close he had believed he was about to lose her. "You did it," he whispered into her hair. "You actually did it." "We did it," she corrected, too tired to argue further than that, and let herself, for the first time in 11 years, simply rest. He carried her from the valley rather than waking her to walk, and she did not protest, too drained even to feel embarrassed about it. Her cheek pressed against his shoulder while the frozen pass slowly gave way to gentler, greener country as dawn broke over the mountains behind them. Somewhere along that long ride south, half asleep, she heard him murmur something into her hair that she was fairly certain he had not intended for her to hear, something about 20 years of silence, and how foolish he had been to think silence was the same thing as safety. She filed the words away to ask him about properly. Later, once neither of them was running on the thin, brittle edge of having nearly died. Chapter 10. They returned to Caldenspire 3 days later to a kingdom that no longer knew quite what to make of her. The council's writs arrived again within the week, but this time they carried a very different tone, full of careful gratitude, and even more careful apology, the eldest councilman personally signing a decree that the warden's bond between Headmaster Vance and Ren Sorrel would stand unchallenged for as long as both parties wished it to continue. Lady Seraphine Voss was expelled, though Alaric, to Ren's quiet surprise, argued for leniency rather than imprisonment, citing the girl's genuine horror at what her gossip had ultimately enabled. Seraphine left Caldenspire in disgrace but alive, and Ren found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she felt nothing but tired relief rather than vindictive satisfaction watching her go. She caught Seraphine once more before the carriage left the academy gates, standing alone with her trunk while the other students pointedly looked away. Seraphine did not apologize, not in so many words, but she met Ren's eyes for a long moment and said quietly, "I hope whatever you're carrying turns out to be worth more than what it's cost you," which was, Ren supposed, as close to an apology as a girl like Seraphine Voss was likely capable of giving. "It already has," Ren said and meant it. Della hugged her so hard upon her return that Ren's ribs ached for a full day afterward, and demanded, with the particular bluntness only a true friend could get away with, exactly how long Ren had intended to keep an entire secret bloodline curse hidden from the person who had shared a dormitory with her for 7 years. "I was protecting you," Ren said. "You were protecting everyone except yourself," Della shot back, and then hugged her again anyway. The academy, slowly, began to change its mind about her. Students who had laughed at her failures for 7 years now watched her in the corridors with a mixture of fascination and unease that Ren found, honestly, only slightly better than the mockery. Professor Hale apologized to her with the stiff discomfort of a man who had spent years building an opinion he now had to entirely dismantle, and offered, somewhat awkwardly, to personally oversee her continued education in controlled spellcraft now that her true ability no longer needed hiding. "For what it's worth," he added, looking genuinely uncomfortable in a way Ren had never once seen from him in 7 years of lessons, "I should have looked harder. A failure that never once surprises the person failing should have told me something far sooner than it did." "You weren't meant to see it," Ren said. "That was rather the point." "Even so." He cleared his throat. "I am glad I was wrong about you, Miss Sorrel. I do not say that often, and I would appreciate your not repeating it to the other staff." "I think," Ren told him with a small smile, "I'd rather keep my other teacher, if it's all the same to you." Hale's eyebrows rose, but he did not argue, only inclined his head with the particular grudging respect of a man who had finally learned, after 7 years, to stop underestimating the girl in front of him. Alaric, when she told him about the conversation that evening in his tower study, did not bother hiding his pleased expression the way he once might have. "You could have any instructor in the kingdom now," he said. "Half the capital's mages would line up for the chance to study you." "I don't want to be studied," she said. "I want to be taught, properly, by someone who already knows what it costs to carry something this dangerous and still choose, every day, to be gentle with it. Even after everything that's happened, after the valley, the seal, nearly losing each other to a war neither of us asked for." "Especially after that," Ren said. "I spent 11 years believing the only safe thing to do with what I am was bury it. You're the only person who ever looked at it and saw something worth building instead of something worth fearing. I'm not interested in trading that for a more impressive title on my education." He crossed the small room and took her face in both hands, the way he had at the foot of the seal, except now there was no valley shaking around them, no fire threatening to consume either of them whole, only the quiet warmth of the warden's bond settled comfortably between their two hearts. "I love you," he said, simply, the words sounding strange and new in his own voice after 20 years of never once risking them. "I have loved you since long before I had any right to, and I intend to spend considerably longer than 7 years proving it if you'll let me." "I think," Ren said, pulling him down to meet her, "you've already started." The kiss that followed tasted faintly of wood smoke, which neither of them found at all strange anymore. Epilogue: a year later, the sealed chamber beneath the North Tower had been transformed into something Caldenspire's oldest professors swore had never existed in the Academy's 2 centuries of history, a proper classroom for the controlled study of bloodline magic, with Ren Sorrel, formal license finally earned, standing at the front of it. There were 3 students this term, 2 found through quiet, careful searching across the northern villages, and one who had simply walked through the academy gates one morning and asked, with admirable directness, whether it was true that the famous Cinderborn instructor took on apprentices personally. "Fire wants to spread," Ren told them, exactly as she had been told a year before, pacing a slow circle around her newest pupil while a small, steady flame flickered obediently in his open palms. "Fighting its nature is exhausting and, eventually, doomed to fail. What you need isn't suppression. It's a riverbed." From the doorway, Alaric watched with the particular quiet pride he had stopped bothering to hide months ago, arms folded, the golden thread of their bond glowing faint and warm between them even across the length of the room. "You're a remarkably good teacher," he said, once the students had gone for the evening, and it was only the 2 of them left in the chamber that had once held nothing but secrets. High praise from a man who spent 20 years convinced that teaching and grieving were the same occupation, Ren said, though she softened it with a kiss to his jaw before he could decide whether to be offended. "I learned from someone patient," she said, leaning back against him as his arms settled around her shoulders. "Della says I get insufferable about it. Apparently I talk about riverbeds at dinner now." "You do," he confirmed, entirely unhelpfully, and laughed when she elbowed him. The council still sent the occasional nervous letter, still maintained careful files on the kingdom's only confirmed Cinderborn, and Ren had long since stopped letting it bother her. The seal in the north held firm, stronger now than it had been in 3 centuries, strengthened by a binding only a willing bearer's own hand could have placed. She no longer dreamed of the farmhouse fire most nights. When she did, Alaric was always there to wake her gently from it, the bond between them carrying her fear before she could even voice it, the way it had carried so much else this past year. Della visited often, usually announced by nothing more than the sound of her boots taking the tower stairs 2 at a time, and on one particularly warm evening, she arrived to find Ren and Alaric exactly where she always found them, curled together by the study fire with a stack of half-graded student essays neither of them had touched in an hour. "You 2 are disgusting," Della announced, dropping uninvited into the 3rd chair. "Genuinely. The whole academy talks about it. The terrifying headmaster, and the girl who failed every spell for 7 years, gone soft as butter the moment her secret got out. Nobody believes it until they see it themselves. We could ask you to leave," Alaric said mildly, not moving his arm from around Ren's shoulders. "You could, but you won't, because I bring gossip, and you're both far too dignified to admit you enjoy it." Della grinned unrepentant, and launched into the latest news from the lower town, and Ren listened with her head against Alaric's chest, feeling the easy, ordinary warmth of an evening that asked nothing extraordinary of her at all. She had spent 7 years convincing an entire academy that she was the worst student it had ever produced, and in the end, it had taken exactly one headmaster paying proper attention to realize she had never been failing at all. She had only ever been waiting for someone worth trusting with the truth. Sometimes, late at night, she still thought about the version of herself who had stood in that practice hall a year ago, deliberately killing a feather charm beneath the laughter of an entire room, certain that smallness was the only safety she would ever be allowed. That girl had not known yet that hiding and surviving were not always the same thing, that some doors only ever opened from the inside, and that the bravest thing she would ever do was not the fight in the frozen valley at all, but the quiet, terrified decision to finally let one person see her clearly. She did not regret a single year of the hiding. It had kept her alive long enough to be found by exactly the right person. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I hope you enjoyed it. Do you think you would have spotted Ren's secret as quickly as Alaric did, or would you have laughed along with the rest of the academy? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and I'll see you soon for another story.